Hello. Today I'm going to be discussing with you guys the ideas of toxic masculinity, where it stems from, and how differing demographics may alter opinions on toxic masculinity. I chose this topic because I've heard so many contrasting opinions about masculinity and toxic masculinity, but I've never really understood the separation of the two or really even the premises of the two. I chose it again because I wanted to explore the dimensions of masculinity to see how hypermasculine media and politics influence gender stereotypes. So, as I began researching, I found that a lot of people did not understand that there was a difference between being masculine and possessing traits of toxic masculinity. I originally thought that to be a toxically masculine man was to essentially be incredibly sexist. However, as I researched, I began to understand that this confusion may come from what Michael Salter calls a catch-all definition for what it means to be a man. That is, there's one definition that we have created that is supposed to conform a large proportion of our world's population. Salter argues that in creating this catch-all, we made an environment that sustains and probably even promotes toxic masculinity. The catch-all definition for manliness and toxic masculinity muddles a distinction in between the two, which causes people to see masculinity as predominantly toxic. So, to first understand toxic masculinity, it helps to understand the creation of it. The phrase toxic masculinity was coined during the mythopoetic men's movement in the 1980s and 1990s. The mythopoetic men's movement was essentially based on two texts: Iron John by Robert Bly and Kind Warrior Magician Lover by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. So, ideas of the movement noted that feminism inadvertently created too much force on femininity into society, and the feminist movement in this time apparently brought too much femininity into men's lives and disrupted their identities. So based off of this, ideas of toxic masculinity have essentially been based around the same ideas ever since. However, these ideas were not brought into such scrutiny until the 21st century. The separation of masculinity and toxic masculinity proves to be important when understanding specifically why toxic masculinity has been under question. So we know that masculinity exists as a real biological attribute like having testosterone. Toxic masculinity, on the other hand, creates actions to reinforce the premise of manliness. In no way does masculinity have the intent of being harmful, but contrastingly, toxic masculinity takes alleged characteristics of being manly and attributes it to culture in a way that has the potential to be harmful. So that's really an in-depth description of the distinction between the two. In an article written by my hometown paper in Washington State, the author reflects on Leonard Sax's novel, The Lost Boys of America. This article notes that the 21st century has been raising boys that are entirely unmotivated and underachieving. The author notes that if America's future wants a chance at success, parents should focus on raising their sons with more drive. I compared this to an article by Taylor Mooney of CNN, who discusses the term man box. A man box describes the socialization of men put into a box per se with specific traits, one of which being underachieving. Boys who underachieve in school seem to be primarily focused on video games and sports, especially at a specific mid-teen age. Through having a lack of drive towards education, it seems that boys have an increasing exposure to hypermasculinity portrayed in the media, which in turn may facilitate the growth of toxic masculine tendencies. Just as with everything today, modern media has created unrealistic expectations for what it means to be a man. Fictional movies and video games may promote hypermasculine messages in the media. The majority of male protagonists in video games, for example, are directly characterized as being oppositional to women, especially in these video games and movies that are aimed at teenage boys. Desirable features of these protagonists are in no way linked to emotion and are mainly based off of strength and violent capacities. Although the characteristics of these protagonists are definitely over-exaggerated, they still promote an underlying message that actions and behaviors of men have to uphold a specific definition. So let's take Call of Duty, for example. The game was undoubtedly created and advertised predominantly for men. Violence and chaos pollute the game. The protagonists and main characters are unrealistically muscular, tall, and strong. Many people would argue that the violence portrayed in games similar to Call of Duty might be linked to real-world aggression in boys. Subconscious violence may progress as these games are normalized, showing men that instead of being emotional, they could rather turn to violence or just like physical action instead of cathartic release. So in this, there is a normalization of misogynistic hate crimes, attack on the feminist movement, and power relations. As I began to dive into societal influences more, I kept coming to the conclusion that although pressures and unrealistic expectations inevitably are a driving force in hypermasculine behavior, toxic masculinity is predominantly linked to one thing: fear. What this fear is directed towards is different for every man, but it seems to be that most time, fear is outwardly manifested as hypermasculine behavior. To link this back to previously discussed topics, it could be said that boys who seem underachieving may take the fear of academic failure and channel it into sports or video games where they can express their emotions physically. Or take locker room talk, for example. Jared Yates of the New York Times argues that locker room talk in the office or on the field stems from the fear of being less bodied than competitors. Fear is unique to everyone's experience, male or female. However, it seems that the way men express this fear results in actions that in most cases come across as toxically masculine. Gillette razors sparked a movement at aiming to call men to be the best version of themselves. Calling to action the Me Too movement, calling attention to the Me Too movement, and bullying, Gillette highlights the importance of responsibility and the power of positive action.
Bullying.
The Me Too movement against sexual
Toxic
harassment.
masculinity.
Is this the best a man can get? Is it? We can't hide from it.
Sexual harassment is taking over.
It's been going on far too long. We can't laugh it off.
Who's the daddy?
What I actually think she's trying to say.
Making the same old excuses.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
But something finally changed.
Allegations regarding sexual assault and sexual harassment.
But she says
And there will be no going back. Because we believe in the best in men.
Smile, sweetie. Come on.
To say the right thing. To act the right way.
Not cool. Not cool.
Some already are. In ways big
Yo, men.
and small.
I am strong.
But some is not enough.
It's not how we treat each other, okay?
Okay.
Because the boys watching today will be the men of tomorrow.
This ad was created to promote the idea that all men have a right to their emotions and to their personal manliness. However, challengers to the commercial definitely thought different. After the ad was released, comments on the video were basically all negative, stating that Gillette was releasing feminist propaganda. Big-name Gillette supporters such as Piers Morgan felt that their manliness was attacked by the commercial and withdrew their support from the razor company. Let boys be damn boys, let men be damn men, says Morgan. Piers Morgan, along with other Republican activists, highlight hypermasculine behavior, Piers Morgan, along with other Republicans, men's rights activists, find toxic masculinity to be emasculating. These men find that when activists highlight hypermasculine behaviors, they're aiming to spread the message that all men are all evil, toxic with their masculinity. So, Republic radio personality Rush Limbaugh poses a similar argument on spreading awareness of toxic masculinity. Limbaugh's main point is that feminists are taking manliness as being rude and bullying and twisting it into their own ideas of toxic masculinity. As the feminist movement calls for men to be held accountable for their actions, Limbaugh argues that this devalues everything manliness has stood for in the past, creating the wussification of America. When comparing demographics, major Republican politicians in general have seemed to majorly reject the ideas of toxic masculinity. Take our Republican President Trump, for example, who uses ad hominem fallacies to play into this fear in men and provokes a reaction, which in turn only fuels behaviors of toxic masculinity. Or rather, consider Fox News. In a sarcastic expose on the war against men, Laura Ingraham states, "Toxic masculinity has infected almost every area of our culture. Dismissing and demonizing the contributions of men throughout history has become inspiring." On the other hand, Democrat Obama called women to get more involved, stating that men have been, quote, getting on his nerves, handling business through violence and bullying. Democrats similar to Obama or Elizabeth Warren have spread awareness towards toxic masculinity, bringing its effects into light. It seems that in the political sense, demographics play a huge role in opinions surrounding toxic masculinity. In a study conducted by Munch and Grise, 42 male college students were asked specific ambiguous questions pertaining to their masculinity. The study found that underlying tones of stereotypical masculinity defined almost all of the students' ideals of manhood. Their ideals were similar to men's portrayed in the hypermasculine video games and TV shows discussed earlier. So, although these men did have a complex understanding and respect for women, they still found it important to be in control of conversations and have this power dynamic, and they also found it important to be the primary breadwinner or source of income in a relationship. So after reading this article, I wanted to see how male college students in my life would react to similar questions, so I decided to conduct a study of my own. I asked 23 college students from my hometown that attend colleges all across the United States 6 different questions. These questions are: 1, who was the primary breadwinner in your house growing up? 2, what sports did you play growing up? 3, what does man up or be a man mean to you? 4, what are the qualities of a good man? 5, what does toxic masculinity mean? And 6, what is healthy masculinity? So, from my study, I found surprisingly that the boys I conducted the study on had relatively similar answers to the boys who the original study was conducted on. When asked, what does man up or be a man mean to you, I found that my results were all relatively similar to one another. Answers like toughen up, grow a pair, or mama didn't raise no bitch were basically present in every single answer. When asked to explain the qualities of a good man, kindness, honesty, and generosity were common. Additionally, strength, the ability to care for loved ones, and athleticism were all equally present. Similar to the men in the original study, qualities like athleticism were still important over emotional ability. When asked what toxic masculinity meant, most of the boys that I conducted the study on answered with responses similar to manipulating people or always wanting to be dominant. I found this to be really interesting when compared to the previous question, which was, what are the qualities of a good man? I found that the boys that I conducted the study on were able to note that to be a toxically masculine man was to desire this power complex and a gendered control, but they still considered their ability to protect and be strong important in their definition of a good man. Similar to the original study conducted, I can assume that the boys questioned in my study can acknowledge the difference of being masculine and being toxically masculine, but they still have residing notions of hypermasculinity in their definitions of what it means to be a man. I found that demographics did not really have an effect on the outcome of the results. The form was sent to boys aging from 18 to 24, attending schools from Georgia to Washington to Colorado. This may be because all of the boys did grow up in the same hometown, but it seems that current residential location and political standing did not really influence their results. So, linked back to the previous fear discussed, Jared Yates argues that above all, fear in the feminist movement is what primarily drives toxic masculinity. So, based off of my study, I do not agree with this statement. I think that fear is the driving factor towards toxic masculinity, but what this fear is derived from is personal to each man. The The modern man is able to understand femininity and show respect for it, but this is not to say that they do not have hypermasculine tendencies and thoughts that are still residing in the back of their heads. Linked back to the socialization of boys to be put in a box, images of manliness continue to be permeated by unrealistic expectations of manhood. It is not to say that being a man is automatically toxic, but rather how each man chooses to present their personal manliness that has a tendency to seem toxic. Toxic masculinity is not the result of societal influences or pressure on gender stereotypes. It exists on a scale that is specific to each man, and although societal influences and pressures definitely play a part in it, it cannot be said that this is the primary influence. So, what can we do to combat the increasing issue of toxic masculinity? To bring awareness to the negative influences toxic masculinity has on growing boys, we need to normalize conversations about masculinity. It should not be something that's controversial, but something that is widely accepted and appreciated across all forums. When we allow ourselves to have multidimensional conversations about gender, we'll allow a society where men in particular do not feel the need to conform to this specific man box and can be free from the pressures of society. So I challenge you all to just push yourselves to have these multidimensional conversations, and maybe just like ask the boys in your life how they feel that they have been affected by toxic masculinity, because I know, like, for me, when I conducted that study, I definitely was not expecting the results that I got. So yeah, the first step that you can do is really just like taking this action and challenging yourself to have these multidimensional conversations. So thank you.